Thank you, Andresa. I'd like to talk, again, hopefully in a complementary way to what we've just heard. I'd like to talk about the issue of violence against women and girls as being a major health and a major safety issue in cities. And this draws on an urban transformation project, which is almost coming to an end. We've been doing it for 2 years now. And obviously we have a short amount of time, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. And I just want to make 3 key points in terms of what I'm going to be talking about. The first is thinking about the city as being inherently gendered. Women and men experience the city very differently. Secondly, violence against women and girls fundamentally undermines gender justice and safety in cities. And then finally, to think about, and this is something that Monique spoke about this morning, is the fact that we shouldn't think about the world as divided into the global north and the global south, but to think about the world in a much more relational way. And I want to talk about the way in which we also need to think about cities as inherently transnational, part of transnational systems, but also violence against women and girls. And I'll explain this as I go through. I'm not going to describe the research in any great depth, but it was a project looking at the Brazilian diaspora in London and also working in a community in Rio de Janeiro called Marais, with a whole series of different partners, which I'll explain as we go along. An important issue, again, in relation to this idea of making sure that we acknowledge very explicitly the fact that cities are gendered. Often, and I'm hoping that that's not the case in these 2 days, thinking about what the good city might be, but often we do see in a lot of urban studies a gender blindness, both in urban theory and in urban policy. A lot of the right to the city debates have been, throughout the 1990s and much more recently have been critiqued, often for being inherently masculinist. In the policy world, this is actually changing, but if we think about the SDGs, we've got SDG 11, which doesn't say that much about gender, and then we've got SDG 5, which doesn't say that much about cities. As I said, these things have changed. The 2006 Quito Declaration actively and explicitly talks about the importance of gender equality in cities, and cities as being potentially emancipatory. So that's sort of thinking about, again, incredibly quickly, thinking about theory, policy, but also empirically, and this is an incredibly obvious point to make, but I think it's a really important point to make, is the fact that women make up the majority of, or will do, currently do, and will do, make up the majority of urban citizens in coming decades. And this is particularly in Latin America, where around 70% of cities in the region that's 70% of the population is urban in many Latin American cities. In terms of the demographics of that, cities often comprise of older women and often comprise of women heading their own households. These are independently living women. And we do have this debate about the gender transformative role of cities. And on the one hand, and this is something just from UN Habitat talk about the fact that there is potential in cities to think in emancipatory ways. However, and then the second point here that I make, when we think about the Beijing Platform for Action, they talk about the fact that actually living in cities, and particularly in certain spaces in cities, they are often marked by high levels of insecurity, high levels of destitution, poverty, and also violence. This takes me to my second point, which is the fact that violence against women and girls in cities fundamentally undermines how cities function. I'm sure everyone knows this, or I hope everyone knows that there's this sort of almost truistic statistic now, which is globally 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of gender-based violence. Urban women, and again this depends on the statistics that we use, urban women are twice as likely to experience gender-based violence as rural women. And again, this depends on the particular type of gender-based violence. But then, and this is a fundamental vogue and also safety issues and fear are fundamental barriers to gender justice and the notion of an emancipatory city. Again, coming to my third point, which is about transnationality, cities are part of global systems and gender relations are part of those. And gender relations, gender identities travel across borders. And they travel in lots of ways, and the one that I'm particularly interested is in relation to ideologies and international migration and how those two intersect. So the work that we've been doing, so I'm not going to say very much, except to say that we wanted to take an explicitly transnational perspective on thinking about violence against women and girls in cities, in different places. As I said earlier, we worked in London, we worked in Rio, and we wanted to take an inherently spatial and an inherently scalar approach to thinking about violence. And in terms of cities, I think the important issue here is we're not looking at domestic violence. Domestic violence is important, but it's only one element of it. We're looking at this whole range of different types of violences. So it's not just what happens in the home. I'm going to concentrate on the London side of things, just because I've got a very short time. But it's just to point out that we worked in a similar way in Rio in terms of methodologically doing survey work, interview work, focus groups, and also working across the social science, arts, disciplinary boundary as well, which I'll just mention very, very briefly at the end. Oops. Again, very, very briefly, in terms of thinking about the incidence and what we found in terms of the incidence of violence against women and girls, we found incredibly high levels amongst Brazilian women in London, 82%. In terms of how we categorised that, almost half was emotional psychological violence, almost 40% was physical, and another 14% was sexual. The important issue, and there was a whole series of complicated and complex processes that were happening here, but what we did find was that awareness of an emotional and psychological violence was not always recognised amongst migrants. And it was certainly, and this also came out when we looked comparatively in Brazil, in that there was actually higher levels of awareness of emotional violence in the London context. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So again, coming back to this sort of key notion of violence being transnational, what we found is that, and again incredibly high levels, 77% of the women that we worked with had experienced this type of violence in Brazil before they migrated, experienced it again in London, and then again another almost half experienced it in the UK. So really what we're saying here with these percentages is that violence occurs in the place of origin, but it also travels in complex ways and then is manifested again and occurs again where people move to. Again, thinking about public spaces and spaces in the city, this 82% that I just spoke about, within that, if we disaggregate that in terms of spaces in the city where violence actually occurs, the vast majority of it actually occurred in public spaces. A lot in the workplace, but also in other public spaces, cafes, bars, transport and public areas. And actually only 22% were in the private spaces of the home. And again, I think this is also very significant for challenging this notion that often people think when we talk about violence against women and girls, we're only talking about what happens in the home. And this clearly isn't the case in terms of the work that we've been doing. Again, very, very briefly, in terms of thinking about the causes and the risk factors of violence against women and girls, the fundamental causes which lie in deep-seated patriarchal relationships and relations, those obtain both in Brazil and in London. And they travel, actually, as well, as people move. But the risk factors are different in both places. However, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the ones that I've identified here are the ones that are actually linked with transnationality. So we have this notion of the legacies of life in Brazil. One of the key issues that women in London spoke about was sexual abuse as they were growing up. And then this had a fundamental effect in terms of how they then dealt with, in particular in terms of reporting and recognising things as being, as violence as being a significant issue in their lives. This then affected their lives in London. Immigration status also emerged as a major risk factor, particularly when women had insecure or some form of irregular immigration status. When this was linked with language competence, it often led to even more problems. So we're not just talking about the violences, the gender-based violences that they experience, say, in the home or in the street, but a whole range of other complex factors that undermine their well-being. We have sexual harassment in the workplace. We have women feeling isolated. This is linked in this example here is when women were unable to speak English. They didn't have their social networks around them. They weren't in their own country. They didn't feel that they belonged, and so that undermined and affected their well-being in terms of how they experienced security and insecurity in the city. So just to think about finishing off, we also asked women about what their views were in terms of addressing and preventing violence against women and girls. What we found, which is really quite a high percentage, is that 56% didn't report any violence, and they only reported very severe and often very severe forms of violence within the home. And a lot of the reporting took place when women went, for example, to contact organisations. We worked, this is a long-term partner of mine, the Latin American Women's Rights Service in London, and they would find that women were reporting when women were going to consult around immigration issues, around housing, around employment support, and it then transpired that they were living in situations of often very severe violence. So we did ask women, as part of the research, what they felt and what they thought, how to address, thinking about solutions, how would they address these types of gender-based violence. They talked about psychological support, education, and society as a whole. This is just some participatory work that we did as well, which also includes things like the church, education, and awareness raising. And that takes me to my last slide, which is about one of the key aims of the work that we were doing, and it's all again about working in partnerships, which Monique spoke about in her lecture this morning, which is also not just about doing the research, but doing the research in collaborations with other organisations in order to highlight and raise awareness around these issues. And we've just published last month the final report from the research, and the title of it, "We Can't Fight in the Dark," actually came from one of the women that we interviewed, and we thought it was just a rather nice way of allowing the voices of the people that we were working with come to the fore. When she just talks about the fact that she wanted to do this research, she wanted to participate in this research because she felt that we couldn't address it until we had the actual information, until we actually had the research. The slide on the right was just to say something very, very briefly, which I don't have time to talk about, but another way that we've been working in this project that I mentioned at the beginning is to work with the arts. We produced again through another collaboration with the Casa Latin American Theatre Festival in London, we produced a verbatim theatre play, which was put on in a festival in London, the Southwark Playhouse in London. We had 3 performances in October. And then actually the really exciting thing was we also took the play and performed it in Rio. And we performed it in the favela of Marais, where the Brazil team were doing the research. And then we also performed it in a feminist theatre festival in downtown Rio as well. And this was another way of communicating beyond just the academic work and the research work. Then finally, I just don't want to finish talking about these issues of violence against women and girls without acknowledging, and I'm presuming that many of you have heard of this, what was the assassination almost a month ago to the day, actually, of Mariella Franco, who was a Rio City councillor who was killed by, well, there's an ongoing investigation, but the argument has been that she was assassinated by various arms of the state. And the reason why I also wanted to acknowledge her is that she was born and brought up in the community where the Bazilti team are actually working. And her assassination has led to, and let's see, and again thinking about what Monique was saying about the city, her assassination has led to a movement of people saying we have had enough of, in this case it's very severe state violence, which is also gendered. It's violence against men as well, but it's also violence against women. So thank you, I'll leave it there.